this, he is ensuring that these people don't end up making life-altering deals with the drug dealing crews in order to get their fix. To polar rights, in the world where the game ruthlessly devours the citizens of Baltimore, Omar's work robbing and even killing those who exploit poverty, addiction, and immense vulnerability is just, good, and effective in helping the citizens of the Western live their lives. That's not to say that Omar isn't doing this for himself, because he absolutely is. His philosophy is that money has no owners, only spenders. And at the end of the day, he is doing this to make a living, using violence to profit off the drug game. The game is the game. But when he loses his boyfriend Brandon early on in the season, that admiration turns into sympathy, thus granting him even more favor from the audience. We learn here exactly how brutal the game is, and we also discover what kind of man Omar is. Despite the game's indifference and brutality, Omar still tries to distance himself from its parasitic clutches. He is radical in that sense. Omar isn't independent in the streets, and he still tries to love, he still sees beauty, he still remains moral, despite the game being everything but those things. To be clear, his morality is one thing, but his morals are very rigid and clear. To quote Ty Fagan in his section of The Wire and Philosophy, he says that in his own way, Omar is deeply moral. It's the game itself that is amoral. Even after having lost Brandon in such a brutal fashion, in a way that surpasses the limits of the game, Omar's retaliation was also within the boundaries created by the Barksdale crew. He never stepped outside of himself to avenge his lover. Topola adds that in The Wire, nearly everyone is corrupt, and even though Omar's code is not traditionally moral, it does promote the use of violence and criminal activity. It does situate him as part of the moral center of the series. Omar is rare in The Wire because he is almost incorruptible, and it's fascinating that he is. Omar is a product of the drug game. It's clearly all he knows. As we see him, he stands only with Butchie as his mentor and his grandmother who raised him. He has no other family aside from his brother, Nohart Anthony, who we only hear about in name. With his own eyes, he has had to build and create this code for himself based on what he's seen and what he's lived through. For whatever reason, Omar's eyes can allow him to discern how many forces are weighing down against them in the underbelly of Baltimore, which is likely the reason why he doesn't belong to any team, any institution. An independent force because he knows how the game works. You have the shotgun, I have the briefcase. He is too intelligent to get roped into being a hopper or a soldier, and he doesn't have the heart to be a dealer, trampling over real people's lives and what they got going on, simply to make more money or to chase power. And he can't leave the game because that's all he's ever known. Omar's Achilles heel, though, is that very heart and that very code. The same reason he kept going back against the Barksdales, against Marlowe, and against whoever, because his principle, his code, is his religion. It's not that vengeance fuels him, but that his code requires him to swing back for those that have wronged him and his loved ones. His loyalty asks that of him. For Omar, that's what being a man is.
Omar don't scare.
One of the focal points of Omar's character is that he is a gay man, entrenched in a world of homophobia. And the first thing that has to be pointed out is that Omar is unashamed of this. Whether it's Brandon or Ronaldo or whoever, Omar flaunts his relationships. He is unflinching in that regard. It's dangerous for him to be a gay man in the game. In that first season, after Omar robs the Barksdale package, they proceed to call him every single slur under the sun. And their brutal retaliation sends a message to Omar, how not only is getting robbed the crime here, but being robbed by a gay man, for these men, is like a notch on their masculinity. They believe it makes them lesser than. So killing and torturing Brandon, being overly violent, is a response to that. Not only do they denigrate him as less than a man, but they also try to emasculate him. Brandon, just like Omar, because they are gay, are seen as lesser than, sometimes even less than human, in the eyes of the patriarchal masculine performance. And so, getting robbed by a gay man infuriates the Barksdale leader even more. Almost like saying, how can somebody lesser than punk me off and act like he is a man? Brandon being killed was one thing. Omar notes that it was part of the game, but being tortured and being put on display for everyone to see, it signals a, quote, violent rage often exhibited in acts of violent homophobia. From Shirin Delami's section on masculinism, mourning, and violence in The Wire. In Queer Theory and Gender Play by Jason P. Vest, they write that Omar, along with his status as a gay man who openly, defiantly, and successfully challenges Avon's primacy, so undermines this position that Avon feels himself financially, strategically, and symbolically emasculated by his gay nemesis. Omar's bravery and ferocity should always be duly noted, as that is the crux of his character. He does not become who he is without the trials he's been through. We don't need to know what Omar has faced for him to be secure and unwavering in not only his sexuality but his masculinity, because he wears it in every single scene, and that's a part of the reason as to why people love Omar. He speaks poetically, he loves without interruption, and he is a man unaffected by these outside forces. If anything, he is even more than a man than anyone else because of
Omar, the only character that actually has a relationship worth envying in the entire show, which is crazy because that was fucking retarded.
his multifaceted nature, because he has a code. Omar has motion.
How is he the only person that has a relationship worth
He is the
envying?
reaper who sweeps the street with his do-rag, his duster, bulletproof vest, and his shotgun, and people scatter at the sound of his name, Omar Khan. He is the most prototypical man in that sense. He is calculated and cunning and strong, and he is intimidating. However, what sets Omar apart in his case for masculinity is that he can be vulnerable and kind. A man who cares so much for his lovers and his friends. A man who can recognize when he's made the wrong play. A man who can weep for those he has failed and those he has wronged and even created. Omar can be gentle but also intimidating and strong, and he chooses accordingly. Masculinity at the end of the day is an expression of gender. It is a performance. Omar being a gay man does not demasculinize him. In fact, when we compare him to a lot of the other men in this series, he has opened himself up to passion, to love, and to be loved, in ways many of the heterosexual men of this series have not, and cannot, because their performance of masculinity does not include tenderness. And that bravery, that willingness to be vulnerable, makes him that much more of a man, to me. There is a sadness that travels Omar's character, grief that follows him. The Politics of HBO's The Wire writes that Omar's grief is immediately transformed into vengeance against those who have exposed his vulnerability being his loved ones. We often hear about how men do not have the spaces to display emotion and grief, ways to properly process this sadness. This is the case for Omar. Anger is often the only acceptable emotion for men, and when pushed, violence only follows. For Omar, it's no different. Violence is the only way he will be understood. It's how the game understands things. With violence, the Barksdales will know that they have trespassed, that they made a mockery of the game and of his emotions, and he gets stuck throughout the series in a cycle of vengeance, grief, and loss. That is the price that he pays being so heavily entrenched in the game. Bunk says that Omar is a predator of the game. He is a parasite that leeches off the already existing problem. His presence has children glorifying him and getting in line to try and be him. His presence, his actions have contributed to creating the monsters of the future. Quote, despite the fact that Omar is cast as the anti-hero of The Wire, who challenges the power of the drug dealers in Baltimore, in his vengeance he reifies many of the norms that make the game the game. Deilami notes. Now to pin that all on an individual goes against the very ethos of the show, because Omar is a symptom. He is a product of the game, and that's why this series is so good and why this character is so fascinating. It is all a dilemma. To love this character is to recognize that dilemma. Omar stands as both perpetrator and victim all the same. An absolute product and victim of the game from his birth. And Omar, despite being berated by Bunk, he listens to his elders, and he sheds a tear, followed by a spit of disgust. Omar knows that Bunk is right to a degree, and that's why we love Omar, because he is sensible, reasonable. His moral code is shown on display here, also when he cries for Tasha, for Brandon. He may be a mythical figure in this world, but he is still just a man, and he is never preachy or conceited. He knows what he's done. He never claims to be this good man. While The Wire, for all intents and purposes, is a gritty, realistic, and quite pessimistic story, how individuals cannot even try to topple gods, that even an attempt will cost not only themselves, but sometimes even their loved ones or their careers and their pursuits, is not a particularly optimistic one. Omar, McNulty, Daniels, Bunny Colvin, and some others, they represent that while Baltimore, while humanity might be sinking, there are still some admirable people in the world, some decent folk. In Omar's case, there are still people who stick their necks out for each other. Omar is loved because, despite the futility of rebellion, as Alan Spinewall notes, day in and day out, he at least chooses some form of humanity, at least a little bit. But as the seasons pass and the game gets more fierce, Omar alongside it, he begins to understand that Baltimore is slowly becoming no country for old men. That it is no longer for people who belong to the past like himself. Like Slim Charles says, the thing about the old days is, they're the old days. When Marlo starts to wear the crown, that becomes especially evident. Omar is beholden to that code, and because he's such an anomaly in that sense, the world that has been built allows him to be the sole mythical-like figure. Although he is a free-flowing, creative, independent force in that world, he is still tethered down to something. But when Omar returns to Baltimore in the final season to avenge Butchie's unjust torture and murder, he comes back seeing red. The people of the street who helped him in the early seasons, he no longer has their ear. He no longer has their eyes. And so when he no longer adheres to being cunning and smart, when he resorts to brute force, that's when he loses his mythical quality. When he kills Savino, but has no real ties to Marlo or what happened to Butchie, that's effectively when Omar Little signed his own death warrant. It's when Icarus flew too close to the sun. Omar gained mortality by killing Savino rather brutally, which in a way goes against his personal morality and code, allowing for someone like Kennard to almost innocuously take him out. Omar didn't get a grand send-off like Stringer or even Bodhi. He didn't get to die on his sword. His death was like a punch to the gut. In a world that has forced Omar to become this person, in a world of institutions that have repeatedly neglected the undercity, for someone like Omar to emerge with even a modicum of kindness, benevolence, and vulnerability is a testament in itself, that it is a path worth choosing. Though he might be a footnote in the newspaper and forgotten down in the morgue, his legacy, his name, still carries weight. Marcia Kinder writes that The Wire shifts the focus from a fascinating individual criminal to a broader analysis of the culture that creates and destroys him. Galen Wilson says that The Spectator is meant to mourn the oppressiveness of Baltimore's social totality when Omar is shot, specifically the impossibility of individuals to resist the system, rather than feel a personal sadness at the loss of Omar as an individual character. But we the spectators, we can't help but feel that sadness, can't we? For the man who dared to be different, he dared to be better than the system, and for a time he was. We mourn Omar, because he shows that having a code that's standing for something is better than the nihilistic or apathetic acceptance that the system will win, that the gods will win. The culture that has created Omar is the same culture that kills him and forgets about him. He is swept under the rug and left to be exactly what he was, a fable. Omar dying at the hands of Kennard that he quote-unquote created is the tragedy of Omar, and the tragedy that the series preaches throughout its 5 seasons. Even for as fabled and as mythically protected as Omar was, he was still a man, pitted against forces beyond him, and in this life you cannot win against the system. These are gods, as David Simon wrote, and the gods will not save you. That is the universal truth of The Wire.
It's on the game though, right?
Bad RNG. Hermalitos! Oh my fucking Jesus! How am I alive? Oh my word, I should have just ran. Well, just playing so awfully. Get that shit out of him.
This photograph is of an incoming class in a South Korean elementary. $172,000 to age 18. And the reason isn't what you'd expect. It's Hagwon. This is how South Korea plans to survive, and whether these plans are actually going to work. So let me show you the first plan, and by far the loudest one, and that is to bribe Koreans into reproducing. Since 2006, the Korean government has spent over $270 billion on pro-natalist policies. Baby bonuses, free childcare, tax breaks, fertility treatments, cash transfers for birth scaled up year after year. The problem is that most of this money didn't actually go to births that wouldn't have happened without them. Instead, the Journal of Asian Economics published a study that found that more than 74% of the cash disbursements went to births that would have happened anyway. The bonus simply shifted the timing of when couples had a kid. It didn't change whether they had one. So why didn't it work? Well, according to this study, Korea is the most expensive country in the world to raise a child, at roughly $272,000 to age 18. And the reason isn't what you'd expect. It's Hagwon. Hagwon are private cram schools that run until 10 p.m. 6 days a week from elementary school onward, which seems like the sort of institution rich people would put their gifted and extremely motivated and conscientious child into, but it's not. Instead, it's probably best described as a necessity if you want your child to get anywhere in life. See, almost every adult outcome in Korea is gated by which university you get into. Specifically, these three: Seoul National, Korea University, and Yonsei, known collectively as SKY. The reason is that SKY graduates run the chaebol, the courts, the senior civil service, and the media. If you miss those slots, your career ladder is practically gone. But less than 2% of students actually get into SKY. So fair to say the competition here is
What?
the CSAT, the single 8-hour exam.
I always say this
designed to
narrative
test in,
doesn't really
rewards
make that much
drilled
sense
pattern
to me.
recognition on extremely difficult material. The problem is, public schools only teaches the standard curriculum. Hagwon teaches that test. So if your kid only goes to public school, their odds of getting in are basically non-existent. Therefore, Hagwon participation is essentially universal. More than 95% of middle school students attend Hagwons. Collectively, these parents are spending $20 billion a year on private tutoring, and because of this, they're choosing not to have a second child simply because they cannot afford another one. So the math here is simply not adding up. A $10,000 baby bonus is a rounding error next to a $272,000 commitment, which brings us to plan 2. Why not just replace all the workers with robots? Look at this. This is a standard coffee shop in Seoul, where the servers are robots. The same goes for this restaurant and this hotel that has automated room service. Now let me be clear here. These aren't gimmicks. If you go to South Korea, this is what you will see more and more of. South Korea has the highest robot density on Earth. They have around 1,000 industrial robots per 10,000 manufacturing workers. The Korean government is investing billions in humanoid robots. They want to be the global leader in physical AI by 2030. And this makes a lot of sense. If automation is total enough, money loses its meaning. Production will become so cheap that scarcity disappears and the pension question becomes obsolete because nobody needs a pension in an economy of abundance. This is the Silicon Valley mission. Full automated luxury, no more work, a post-scarcity utopia. South Korea is the test case for whether that vision arrives on time, because Korea's pension system has to hold together until 2071. The working age population drops 44% by 2067. The abundance economy, if it's coming, has to arrive within those timelines, or it doesn't matter. And here's what Korea's own data shows. Korea, as we already know, has the highest robot density on Earth, but the productivity gains have gone almost entirely to chaebol shareholders. The automation creates abundance for everyone thesis requires solving a political problem. Who owns these robots? That one, Korea has not even begun to solve. So the question isn't whether robots can theoretically save Korea. The question is whether the politics of robot-driven wealth distribution gets solved in time. And honestly, nothing in the Korean political economy suggests it will. So let's move on to plan 3. Import workers selectively. The Korea Employment Information Service has estimated that Korea will need 900,000 additional workers by 2032 just to maintain a 1.9 to 2.1% growth rate. Currently, Korea has one main visa for low-wage foreign labor. It's called the E9. Think factory workers, agricultural workers, and shipbuilders. They can stay for 3 to 5 years but have no path to citizenship, and no families are allowed either. In 2024, Korea had 335,000 workers on this visa and is bringing in another 130,000 in 2025, which sounds like a lot until you do the math. Sure, over 1 million workers may arrive on this visa, but they are all on a clock. They leave when their visa expires. Look, Korea is one of the most ethnically homogenous societies in the developed world, about 95% Korean. According to the 2024 Korea Social Integration Survey from the Korea Institute of Public Administration, 45.9% of Koreans say they accept foreign nationals as members of society. Sounds open. But here's the thing, only 7.2% say they accept migrant workers as actual members of Korean society. And the polling consistently shows a strong preference for what Korean scholars call co-ethnic migrants, which is another way of saying foreigners but with Korean ancestry. Of the 2.73 million foreign citizens in Korea today, about 850,000 of them are actually ethnic Koreans returning home from China and the post-Soviet Soviet states. The immigration Korea is willing to accept is mostly just Koreans coming home. For everyone else, the structure is temporary by design. But to replace a 44% drop in the working age population through immigration alone, Korea would need to admit roughly 15 million foreign workers and their families by 2067, which would make Korea about 30% foreign born. And there is no political coalition in Korea today that would accept that. So this plan doesn't work either. Bringing us to plan 4, import the wives instead. Here's the problem Korea couldn't solve. Rural Korean single men. The farmers, the fishermen, the men in the counties 2 or 3 hours from Seoul. They haven't been able to find a wife. And that makes a lot of sense because by the 1990s, every young Korean woman in those towns had left for the cities to get better jobs, better dating pools, better lives. And the rural men were left behind. These men stayed because they owned the farm or the boat or the family land. So someone figured out at some point that if you can't find Korean wives, you import them instead from places where the economic gravity runs the other way. So they did, from Vietnam, the Philippines, Cambodia, and rural China. The mechanism here is simple. A woman in rural Vietnam has limited prospects. A Korean farmer has land, citizenship, a passport, and money she can send home. The match is asymmetric, but for both sides, it solves something. The cost of these wives is published data. According to Korea's Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, a wife from Vietnam runs around $12.6 thousand, and from China, about $7.5 thousand. And here's the part nobody wants to talk about. Korean rural counties actively subsidize this. As of 2025, over 35 municipalities run cash programs paying men up to $14.5 thousand to marry foreign women. Everyone pretends it isn't immigration, but it has been running quietly and successfully for over 30 years, and is Korea's only sustained mass migration program. It's basically the only thing keeping rural Korea demographically alive. But here's where it gets darker. It turns out rural Korean men who can't find Korean wives or afford Vietnamese or Chinese wives are buying them from North Korea, which I know is a massive side tangent, and it's actually a whole story on its own, and I just simply couldn't fit this into this video, so instead I wrote it up properly for my newsletter Outpost. If you want to know how that whole thing works and get every source for this video as well, the link will be the first one in the description down below. It's free. But let's talk about the elephant in the room here, the children of these marriages. Because here's the thing, the Koreans call these multicultural children, and they have been documented to face systematic discrimination and bullying in schools. The bullying is severe enough that the ministry funds anti-discrimination curriculums. But despite all of this remains Korea's most successful immigration policy, which tells you everything you need to know about how successful the others are. 4 plans deployed, hundreds of billions of dollars spent, 20 years of effort, and the fertility rate kept falling from 1.24 in 2015 to 0.72 in 2023, the lowest ever recorded anywhere in peacetime, which makes it even more strange what happened next. Because in the following year, in 2024, Korea's fertility rate rose for the first time in 9 years. It did the same in 2025, and then in January 2026, the monthly fertility rate hit 0.99, the highest single-month figure in nearly 7 years. 18 consecutive months of year-on-year increases in monthly births. If we look at this isolated, you might be thinking, wait, the plans worked? No, they didn't. Here's why. This rebound is simply a statistical illusion produced by 3 things that have nothing to do with the policy. See, Korea had one of the strictest pandemic regimes in the developed world. Weddings were postponed for 2, 3, even 4 years, which is important because in Korean culture, marriage is a near prerequisite for childbirth. Single motherhood is heavily stigmatized, and single women cannot legally access IVF. So when the pandemic ended, 2 years of suppressed weddings were released at once. Secondly, births are clustering right now because there is a larger cohort of women in prime childbearing age. This means more total births, even if the per woman rate stays low. Thirdly, marriage migration and immigrant fertility. Some of the rebound is foreign-born women who have higher fertility rates than Korean-born women. But this will stop by the late 2020s, because international marriages peaked in the mid-2010s and have been declining ever since. So the COVID backlog will clear, and the underlying trend, the rate at which a typical Korean woman in her prime expects to have children, has not budged a single centimeter. But funnily enough, the government is already declaring victory. The official narrative is forming around the idea that the plans worked. But let's move on to the next plan, the one you're not really supposed to say out loud. Wait for North Korea to collapse. Look, North Korea has 26.4 million people. Their fertility rate is estimated to be around 1.78, well above the South's 0.72. Until the early 2000s, North Korea was a younger, faster-growing society than the South. The age pyramid still bulges in the under 40 brackets in a way the South just doesn't. If the Kim regime falls and the Korean Peninsula unifies on Seoul's terms, South Korea inherits 26 million new citizens, most of whom are of working or military age. The demographic crisis would, on paper, be solved. This is why the Ministry of Unification still exists. This is why Park Geun-hye, in her January 6, 2014 press conference at the Blue House, said unification is a jackpot. But the backlash to that statement was instant. South Koreans called her tone deaf about the human cost. So the slogan was quietly retired, but the planning kept going, just behind the scenes. And here's what they found. The South Korean government's own most recent figure puts the integration cost at over $3 trillion across decades, including infrastructure, social welfare, and economic revitalization, which is a lot of money considering South Korea's entire GDP is around 1.7 trillion. But that's just the economic impact. The geopolitical implications are where it gets really tricky, in particular because of the existence of China. China does not want a unified US ally Korea on its 1,400-kilometer border. China China cannot absorb the refugee flow that a collapse would send into Manchuria, and China will not allow North Korea's 40 to 50 nuclear warheads to be secured by an American operation alone. These are the same reasons China sent hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu in 1950 when American forces approached the border. The strategic logic hasn't changed. So if North Korea collapses, China moves in, which is a problem for the South Korean plan of a demographic windfall, meaning this plan is also not very realistic. So let's discuss the last available plan, Plan 6. And this one is a bit of an extension of the one I mentioned earlier about automation, but it's a bit more serious. Basically, bet everything on exports. This bet is interesting because it accepts that their population will disappear, and they will instead keep the economy running by selling increasingly more of their products to the world. There's just one kind of big problem with this idea: competition. South Korea has some behemoth companies like Samsung, SK, Hyundai, and LG. So it does make sense that you would think they could drive all the economic growth necessary. It is an ambitious plan, so let's look at where that plan is right now. TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor company that everyone is talking about right now, is currently eating Samsung's foundry business at the leading edge, as Samsung is years behind on 2nm yields. Chinese memory makers like YMTC and CXMT have closed the technology gap on Samsung's bread and butter, DRAM, and NAND business faster than analysts predicted. Safe to say, this plan is not going to work for a lot longer. So here's where we stand. None of their 6 plans, bribing people, automating, importing workers collectively, tolerating marriage migration, hoping for some external windfall, betting on a handful of national firms, will work. The fact that all 6 are running simultaneously in Korea with none of them coordinated, with all of them failing on their own terms, and with the government quietly preparing to declare victory on a statistical illusion, that is crazy, but it's also the preview. What happens in Korea over the next 5 to 10 years is what happens to half the developed world by 2060. The question isn't really whether Korea will survive. Korea will survive. It will just be smaller, older, poorer, and more dependent on alliances it cannot reciprocate. The question is whether the developed world model survives. Korea is testing whether a wealthy democracy can solve a demographic crisis through policy, and as we've seen, the answer so far is no. That's the lesson here. But here's the thing, South Korea is just one country. While I was researching this video, I kept finding myself pulled out into the bigger picture of this. Why is every single developed country on this same trajectory? What happens in the next 10 years when the first pension systems start failing? What will the world look like by 2050 when the developed world drops below 15% of the global population? What about 2080 when the countries we think of as powerful today simply aren't anymore? I had to know, so I ended up writing a full breakdown. The whole Western fertility crisis explained from the ground up, short to medium and long-term futures. What will actually happen to the world? The thing is, that kind of work doesn't get rewarded on YouTube. Trust me, I've seen it time and time again. But I know that there are people like myself watching this right now who would love to read this. So that's why I created the Insiders here in my newsletter Outpost. Insiders get a full deep dive paired to every video. The one paired with this one, the Western fertility breakdown, is live right now. Plus you get a monthly counterfactual. For example, what happens when Putin dies? As well as a monthly field note on the structural patterns shaping how the world works. Look, if you've made it this far, you're probably the right kind of person for it. The link will be the first one in the description. Check it out if you want. But that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching.
Just absolutely. Why would you hit me? What was... Why would you hit me though, pussy? Now I'm just tired. I just want to go to sleep. What the fuck are you in front of me? Yeah, I missed the time too. I looked away from my screen. What's happening? That was an accident. I really needed that to be something other than that. Well, now I just need to play hyper aggro. Waiting for them Insta.
Welcome everyone to the AA. I think I'll just give a imagining and creating,
such as those mounted in recent years in the galleries and museums. Since the days of my archive. So much, Brendan. Thank you for this invitation. I'm just coming straight out of class up the road at UCL, so my brain is a little frazzled, so I've made notes to help me. I want to just start by saying this, what I'm going to present is really just the beginning of a discussion which started quite recently with forensic architecture, and in particular with Eyal Weizmann. Eyal tells me that he actually was here quite recently giving a talk, so he didn't want to overstretch your hospitality by coming again quite so soon. And it's very important for me to acknowledge the work of my colleagues, my archaeologist colleagues, John Chapman, Vysoka, Gajdaska, Marko Nebia, and Sasha Diachenko, whose original fieldwork and research, everything I'm going to talk about today is really based on that. So here we go.
You don't have fun with that.
The remote history of the countries around the Black Sea is awash with gold. At least any casual visitor to the major museums of Sofia, Tbilisi, or indeed Kiev could be forgiven for leaving with that impression. Ever since the days of Herodotus, outsiders to the region have come home, full of lurid tales about the lavish funerals of warrior kings, the mass slaughter of horses and human retainers that accompanied them. And over 1,000 years later, in the 10th century AD, the traveller Ibn Fadlan was telling almost identical stories to impress and titillate his Arab readers. As a result, in the lands around the Black Sea, the term prehistory, or sometimes proto-history, has always evoked the legacy of aristocratic tribes and lavish tombs, topped with these great earthen mounds and crammed with treasure. Treasure. which attracts looters and archaeologists, which commands eye-watering prices at auction, and which now travels the world in equally lavish exhibitions such as those mounted in recent years in the galleries and museums of New York, London, Paris, Berlin, and so on. But it turns out this wasn't the whole story. In fact, magnificent warrior tombs might not even be the most interesting aspect of the region's prehistory. There were also cities. In the fertile fields of central Ukraine, less than a meter beneath the black soil, archaeologists in the 1970s began to find evidence of an urban tradition extending back 6,000 years. The first traces were noted from the air, when the crops were low, by the military topographer K.V. Shishkin. In a pioneering application of new field methods, Soviet and Ukrainian archaeologists began adding flesh to the picture outlined by him, not just by excavation, but also by peering gently into the ground with techniques of magnetometry, originally designed to locate unexploded ordnance. In this way, they were able to swiftly cover large areas of ground, and the results were astonishing. Settlement plans of striking coherence began emerging from the ground. During the Cold War, archaeologists in Western Europe remained largely oblivious to these findings, and their implications were little discussed. All of this was rapidly changing in the years and decades before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. International teams were active in the region. In one particular location, about 1 hour's drive east of the city of Uman, archaeological prospecting using high-precision geomagnetic techniques was exposing magnificently clear images of a site that would make it necessary to rewrite the history of urbanism. On the southern Bug-Dnieper interfluve, near the modern village of Nebelivka, a shallow hilltop was found to contain more than 1,000 equally sized domestic buildings, arranged in several large circumferences around a mysterious empty center, covering an area roughly the size of medieval London. As ancient and as large as the first cities of Mesopotamia, long considered to mark the origins of urban life, the buried settlement at Nebelivka contains no evidence of temples, palaces, central administration, rich burials, or other signs of centralized control or social inequality, often considered typical of early cities. Instead, archaeology reveals a system of neighborhoods, each with a single, larger structure, suggesting to some the existence of self-governing districts with assemblies for local decision-making. Apart from their size, I should add, these larger structures are essentially similar to ordinary dwellings, but with accentuated entrances, and they lack the usual evidence for storage and preparation of food or other signs of permanent habitation. There is nothing in these buildings to suggest that they housed a political or religious upper class. Chapman and Gajdarska, co-directors of the Nebelivka City project, note pointedly, and I quote, that those expecting the architectural and artifactual reflections of a hierarchical society, with elites ruling over thousands of inhabitants in the Tripilia megasites, will
Are you
be disappointed.
fucking serious?
And that the so-called megastructures, these larger buildings, have
They
and I quote
spawned
again,
3 back
none
there?
of the depositional characteristics of a ritual or administrative center, but rather of meeting spaces that were used intermittently for larger gatherings within each of the urban districts. Nebelivka and associated sites of what prehistorians call the Tripilia culture manifest high levels of creativity in domestic material culture. This is an illustration of one of those larger buildings, and on this map, you can see the proposed reconstruction of those districts. And here is some of that staggeringly beautiful material culture. There are these rich traditions of miniaturism, modeling, and image making. Studies of their economy suggest small-scale cultivation in gardens of cereal crops, sometimes within the bounds of the settlement, combined with the keeping of livestock, the tending of orchards, and a wide spectrum of hunting and foraging activities. The diversity of this prehistoric economy is notable, as is its sustainability, because another surprising feature of these Ukrainian cities is their light ecological footprint, as exposed through the study of pollen sampled from sediment cores in their vicinity. All of this has led to a dispute, an academic dispute, about whether these sites were inhabited more or less permanently, all the year round, or perhaps just for seasonal gatherings, or something in between. The problem is exacerbated by uncertainties and imprecisions in the chronological phasing of the site's development and by the ancient residents' strange habit of deliberately and periodically burning down some portion of their otherwise substantial houses, reducing them to compressed platforms of incinerated wattle and daub on stone foundations. Extreme opinions exist on either side of this dispute. Some archaeologists find the persistence of human cohabitation unthinkable on such a scale, without central organization and a heavy environmental footprint. They imagine Nebelivka as a sort of Chalcolithic equivalent to the Burning Man festival, something like that. Others, taking the extreme opposite view, point to evidence of more permanent
Oh my
habitation,
god, it's beautiful
including the
today. I
robustness
need
of
to go
Tripolitan
outside.
domestic architecture, elements of fixed infrastructure, such as communal kilns and large ditches, as well as the remains of fixed domestic installations and heavy equipment for food processing, preparation, and storage, not to mention the prevailing economic regime itself, which included a significant component of cereal farming. I'll come back to these questions and arguments in a short while. To put them in context, it's important to stress that Nebelivka is not an isolated case. More than 10 of these
Yeah, I
gigantic
can handle it.
sites, each covering an area of more than 100 hectares, have been documented in rural parts of Ukraine and neighboring Moldova, where they date between
Oh
4,000
my
and 2,200
god!
BC. Others are no doubt hidden, or largely hidden, under modern development. Some of these sites, such as Maidanetska and Dobrovolny,
Why?
reached sizes of around 250 hectares, comparable with the largest Mesopotamian cities of the time, while Talyanki, the largest currently known, is thought to have extended over roughly 300 hectares. These huge sites lie within surprisingly easy reach of each other, at a distance of about 10 to 15 kilometers on the open grasslands. Based on a geophysical and geochemical
Fuck you
analysis
doing?
of soils and sediments excavated at the site of Maidanetska,
What the
the
fuck?
German archaeologist Johannes Müller and his
You need to
colleagues
die.
have recently made an extraordinary, and some might say, slightly outrageous claim. Their counterintuitive suggestion is that the forms of agriculture practiced at these giant sites were not only sustainable, but also enhanced processes of soil formation. In other words,
What?
at least some component of the famously rich local Chernozem, or black soils, may in fact be anthrosols, a human-produced
Wow.
soil. This audacious theory says that the production of this soil...
To be fair, I wasn't even really paying attention to what was happening there, because I wasn't expecting to get hit there.
The basic idea,
I
as I
thought I would have
understand it, is
regen.
that the existence and subsequent decay of these large-scale settlements unleashed a biological process, I don't have time to discuss it here in much detail, which resulted in the creation of black soils. If true, then this stands for a much grander claim, that the famous Chernozem of Ukraine is in fact an archaeological artifact, a result of a city or cities
Yeah, give me that bomb
interacting
though.
with nature. I think this
Do
seems
it.
far-fetched. Look at the extensive and the uniform distribution of those soils in the wider region. But let's at least consider some possible implications that would follow if urban life really did generate geological change on this scale, well before what most people in the scientific community consider to be the onset of the Anthropocene. It would mean, remarkably, that at least some parts of what the ancient Greeks came to regard as the barbarian steppe may in fact be rooted, not just historically, but also ecologically, in a lost urban tradition, already long forgotten by the time of Herodotus. The spatial reversal of cultural stereotypes, civilized and barbarian, seems all the more poignant because, on current reconstructions, the prehistoric settlements of the Ukrainian steppe forest zone also constitute a temporal reversal of political history, presenting traces of a robustly egalitarian tradition of urban life approximately 3 millennia earlier than what is traditionally thought of as the birth of democracy in ancient Greece. And yet, the terms city and urban have so far been largely denied to Nebelivka, Talyanki, Maidanetska, and other contemporary urban centers of the Tripolia culture. They are referred to in the literature mostly by the nondescript term megasites, owing to their lack of conformity with theoretical models of urbanism, which assume the presence of hierarchy and control as core features. This euphemistic treatment highlights the anomalous character of the megasites on a world historical scale, and their lack of salience to wider debates over the character and development of human life in cities. And to some extent, I think it's worked. Beyond a small and specialized circle of prehistorians, these sites remain little known, despite a certain amount of recent media coverage. Scholarly justification for this practice of sorting and exclusion among cities and non-cities is presented as technical, couched in terms of abstract, scalar models and jargon-freighted theories of social complexity, often resting upon outdated and speculative notions of group psychology. However, in recent years, the scientific objectivity of such procedures has been brought into question through a mass of empirical and theoretical work, some of which is highlighted in my recent book, co-written with the late anthropologist David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything. Some months after the publication of the book, I was approached by the director of forensic architecture, Eyal Weizmann, who in turn had been approached by Anselm Franke, then of the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, to take part in a 3-day conference called Die Zivilisationsfrage. The civilization question, there it is. We took over the HKW for a few days. This was devoted to a discussion and a critique of our book, The Dawn of Everything. After some time in conversation, it became apparent, to us at least, that despite their radically different scales of analysis, there was a kind of weird intersection between the objectives and the methods of my archaeological collaboration with David and the kind of counter-forensic procedures undertaken by forensic architecture when investigating the complicity of state actors in a wide array of contemporary human rights violations, including, for example, tracing causal links between official state policy, gold mining, and violence against indigenous communities in Brazil, extrajudicial killings in Palestine, and the application of illegal techniques of border defense to refugees in the waters of the Eastern Mediterranean. More particularly, we felt, in seeking to undermine the authority of state narratives by extracting counter-archives of forensic information from physical crime scenes, Weizmann's forensic architecture is strangely aligned with our project of finding evidence in the archaeological record to confront established historical narratives, which positioned the modern state and its technologies of control as a telos of social and political evolution. We also discovered a spatial correspondence between our agreed focus of attention, the prehistoric site of Nebelivka and its exceptionally rich Chernozem soils, and the sites of recent human rights violations which have already attracted the interest of forensic architecture. The equivalent of a crime scene that we now propose to investigate jointly was painted with a much broader brush across multiple continents within a colonial paradigm of archaeological fieldwork that for some time now has been under sustained scrutiny by researchers. Its results were perhaps most succinctly expressed by the prehistorian V. Gordon Child, the former director of the institute up the road where I work, in his seminal 1950 essay for the Town Planning Review called The Urban Revolution, which, as I discovered some years ago when I was first invited here by Pierre Aureli, is one of the few texts that contemporary architects and students of architecture might have read that was written by an archaeologist, still 70 years after its publication. Now, I'm not going to rehearse Child's arguments in this paper, which are much too famous now to need any repeating. But I will ask you to reflect for a moment on the images that accompanied the paper, illustrated the paper, and in particular, how the kind of technical procedures involved compare with those which led to the more recent discovery and investigation of the Ukrainian megasites. I would draw your attention in particular to the almost industrial scale of earth removal, illustrated here at the site of Harappa in Pakistan, which precluded the careful investigation of soft building materials, like unbaked mud brick, for example, and indeed often involved the wholesale destruction of more ephemeral layers of architecture. The result was to produce images of settlement forms that were, to a large degree, entirely new creations, compressing multiple historical phases into flat ground plans, illustrated here by the site of Uruk Warka in southern Iraq. And by the way, it's important to note that we still know almost nothing whatsoever about the organization of ordinary households and residential districts at this, one of the earliest cities in Iraq, Mesopotamia, because of the almost exclusive focus of the excavators on its acropolis and its monumental architecture in the center. Plans like these were then raised into 3 dimensions through the kind of axonometric reconstructions that were very popular and ubiquitous in publications at the time.
Ed.
In the felicitous terms coined by Jim Scott, this style of urban archaeology made legible, or in some cases actually created, powerful and entirely new images of state surveillance and control, testifying to a causal link between the growth of cities and the growth
Beautiful board.
a cogenesis
Beautiful board.
state. I say created
Little
because many of these reconstructions have since been
revival.
questioned by archaeologists. Some have been rejected in favor of others.
Oh, it's a
which
triple
argue
board now.
for the likely existence of open and democratic public spaces, as well as robustly egalitarian distributions of housing and resources, or for the coexistence of hierarchical institutions with earlier traditions of collective governance, or indeed for quite fluid temporal reversals and alternations between them. The jury is out, and pretty much everything is contested about the political organization of early cities, whether we're in Yucatan or on the floodplains of southern Iraq. Even within the histories of individual urban sites, we may, these days, need to take account of multiple urban revolutions, evidence of which can be detected in the archaeological record from the pre-Shang city of Taosi in China's Jinan Basin,
Reshang. What the
metropolis
fuck?
of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico. And here, I'm following a very simple definition of a revolution. It's actually Tolstoy's definition. He said, a revolution is simply a change that occurs in a people's relation to power. As a result of this changing global context, archaeological findings from an otherwise unassuming district of rural Ukraine now occupy center stage in a debate over the very meaning of urbanization. Our proposition is not really to make the case for cities against the state, but to create a point of reflection for these debates focused on a dynamic visual model of the site of Nebelivka. Among other things, we want to explore how archaeological understandings of the Ukrainian megasites, sparking these debates about egalitarian cities, how these understandings could really only emerge as a consequence of new ways of seeing, to quote the brilliant John Berger book and documentary series from the 1970s. These ways of seeing are generated by new analytical sensibilities.
How the fuck are you not
focusing on
dead?
the archival
Pussy?
properties of soil
The fuck are
and
you
sediment.
doing?
A shift of scientific focus that also opens up new kinds of comparison with the growth of early cities in other parts of the world, like Southern Africa, Amazonia, Yucatan, China, Southeast Asia, and more. In each case, the shift from large-scale
Needlessly
exploration
risky.
to the imaging and analysis of soils reveals dramatic evidence. You can pick out
Actually, maybe that was
contours
good.
and the outlines of an extraordinary number of buildings in this image from Ecuador, courtesy of the brilliant archaeologist Eduardo Neves. So these are urban landscapes lurking, otherwise unsuspected, beneath the cover of forests and grasslands. It's all quite preliminary at the moment, this new collaboration of ours, but our basic idea is to kind of follow the ethos of the ancient megasite builders, to look at how processes of social learning and reasoning are captured in the act of making images and models. In particular, how parametric modeling techniques arising from the study of architecture can enhance the
Neurodead.
process of archaeological interpretation and vice versa. And it's worth recalling here the maybe obvious point that prehistoric archaeology is the art and the science of interpreting evidence without verbal testimony or written testimony. Evidence here refers to material culture, in this case, both the soil and the artifacts. But evidence without testimony is always underdetermined. As David Clarke famously put it, archaeology, in essence, then, is the discipline with the theory and the practice for the recovery of unobservable hominid behavior patterns from indirect traces in bad samples. Still the best definition of my field in the 1960s. Such traces can open up possibilities, and they can constrain them. And there's always a multiplicity of these extending between data points. But without due care, the traces themselves can become obscured or even trammeled by top-heavy theoretical constructs or freewheeling speculation. Archaeologists often treat indeterminacy as a caveat to interpretation, or as an invitation to patch over the gaps and the silences in the evidence with totalizing theories of social change and scalar change. The approach we want to take is different. By contrast, in the model, which I'm going to try to show you here, and I really want to emphasize, this is just a draft. We just got going. There it goes. What we try to do here is really to embrace and then to simulate multiple possibilities in the life and in the growth of a single site, Nebelivka. What you're seeing here is a speedrun of the procedural prototype tool designed by Davide Bischitelli for forensic architecture, where possible distributions and spreads of buildings are generated, with attention to the changing status of individual dwellings, the ones which are burnt and the ones which are not burnt, through a set of rules that consider the spatial organization of the site based on its geomagnetic plan. As he describes it, it's kind of a machine for modeling the indeterminacies of the data and the possibilities that they introduce, adding parameters as we go along. And one of the next things we'll do, by the way, is feed in the radiocarbon database more thoroughly into this model, again, to narrow down the constraints and add some more parameters, add some more variables. I see what we're doing here, in a way, as analogous to what David and I attempted on a much coarser and broader scale in The Dawn of Everything. There, we surveyed an array of past urban forms and modes of organization in order to query nomothetic approaches to scalar change in human societies. Here, we see how, by working within the constraints and the possibilities of a single dataset, a multiplicity of possible urban worlds can be shown to coexist at the very same site. Now, of course, only a few of the paths you are seeing will actually have been taken historically. But all of them could have presented themselves to conscious historical actors as viable alternatives in the remote past, perhaps moving us a little way beyond condescending ideas of primitive architecture or vernacular architecture as non-discursive or as symbolic of a static worldview, or as merely adapting to its environment. By reversing the figure-ground relation of traditional archaeology and museum display, we also want to try and consider what can be learned when the logic of unearthing, the extraction, the cleansing, and the purification of objects from the earth shifts towards
Don't play with me today. Not today. Tomorrow, but not today.
Materiality of the earth itself as a primary
I said
medium
fuck you to
for
tomorrow, man.
investigation. In this
I mean, it has to be done today.
anti-museum, no objects
Understand the
are
assignment.
displayed. Instead, the densities and the textures of the viscous black earth of the Ukrainian steppe would take center stage in a top-down projection, creating a kind of archaeological theatre with which people can interact. In this theatre, which as you can tell is still only very vaguely conceived in our own heads,
Has to be now.
relations of surface to depth revealed through subsoil scans would frame a series of competing propositions about the possibilities of human coexistence with the land. In a way, we feel, and this is our motivation for doing it really, that the stakes are quite high. The standard narrative of state formation rests on a denial that sites such as Nebelivka can in fact be considered cities, since acknowledging them as such would demand that we rewrite the history, both of urbanism and of the state. The kind of visual installation that we want to try and construct, its main purpose will be to explore the forms and the strategies taken by this process of denial, this process of negation. In doing so, it would bring to the surface a series of strong claims and highly conservative assumptions about the nature of cities, claims that otherwise might remain implicit or obscured by a veneer of pseudoscientific jargon, and then expose them to direct questioning. We might frame this as a series of propositions and refutations. Nebelivka cannot be a city. It cannot be a city because it's too small, right? If it's too small, then size matters, yes? It cannot be a city because it's too ephemeral, okay? It's too ephemeral. That means that permanence matters. And it cannot be a city because it lacks complexity. It lacks complexity. So organization matters. Now, rather than trying to present an alternative reconstruction, the model that we have in mind will use visual parameters to interrogate the elements of this pervasive logic. It's a little bit, as Eyal points out to me, along the lines of that famous parable of Sigmund Freud, the one about the neighbor who has to explain why the kettle that they borrowed was returned broken, and who simultaneously deploys not one, but 3 arguments. The kettle wasn't broken. The kettle was already damaged when I borrowed it, and I never borrowed it in the first place, regardless of the fact that all these arguments are logically incompatible. Now, similarly, I would suggest to you, if size matters, then it matters that Nebelivka covers an absolute area as large as that of contemporaneous sites in Mesopotamia, which are routinely identified as cities, despite the fact that we often know far less about ordinary living arrangements within them. Remember the case of Uruk-Warka, as I noted earlier, where we still know almost nothing about residential quarters in the earliest phases of what everyone calls a city. If permanence matters, then surely we must compare like with like. Human mobility and seasonal flux of population sizes undoubtedly were characteristic of Mesopotamian cities too. And since there's never been a city with a totally static or captive population, why would we conjure one up from thin air to compare with Nebelivka? If organization matters, let's consider the fluid complexity of Nebelivka's economy. How for centuries, almost 1,000 years, its inhabitants carefully balanced and syncopated the rhythms of cultivation, harvesting,
Syncopated?
herding, foraging, and
Fuck
hunting
does that
into a
mean?
steppe forest ecotone. Let's consider its coordinated movements of salt, stone, timber, copper, and pigments over long distances.
Oh
Let's consider
god.
the precociousness of its domestic arts and crafts. And
That
let's
was in
also
the end?
the radical simplification of Neolithic ecologies, including hydraulic and arable systems, by later states and empires in regions like Mesopotamia, to serve the efficient extraction of energy, resources, and taxable produce, and also their rigid standardization of material culture through centrally administered production. Let's consider all of these things.
What
Now,
the
I guess you can see at this point why we're calling the work provisionally Cities Against the State. This is a school of architecture, so you understand architectural evidence, and almost everything we're talking about here is based on a reading of architectural evidence against the telos of state formation. We want to try and suggest that if one learns to look at such evidence differently,
When do you
can see
stop
that
gaining
cities
points?
existed,
Of the
not merely
500,
as
I think?
incubators for the state, but as potential arenas
Or
for many
70.
other ways of organizing human societies. That people have devised other modes of living together in radical proximity, which allow them to bypass the interests of predatory elites and their technologies of surveillance, domination, and control. But our thesis is not just a contrarian one. We have another possible title for our work, as you can see even the title is underdetermined at the moment, which is the Nebelivka hypothesis, which is a much more propositional type. And the proposition is that there have been complex modes of urban existence which conserve the life-giving forces of the environment, using less and preserving more.
Yeah,
and
put down, boy.
that living in a city such as Nebelivka
I want to go
has
21
reduced,
flawless.
or at least amplified, the vitality
21 flawless,
that
please.
it inhabits. As it stands, the materials to substantiate this far bolder hypothesis currently lie buried, not within the vaults of the world's great art museums and galleries, but just a few centimeters under a field of sunflowers in central Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it's terribly exciting. The idea of this exhibition or this interactive exhibit, which for me I think was really exciting in the sense that the theme of the lecture series and the kind of workshop as well was how can architects potentially empower others to become their own world builders in a way, imagine different histories, empower people to become, even in a sense, their own architects. So I love the idea that if I understood correctly, the exhibition would allow people to actually test multiple different scenarios.
Exactly.
and in a sense start really opening their mind as well through the interaction with the exhibition somehow. So
Right, yeah, that's exactly how we see it, yeah.
it's great. Yeah. Why don't we take some questions from the audience? We have a mic to go around. Yeah. There's one here. Yeah. Just raise your hand up. Nice.
Hello. Thank you for that. That was great. Forgive me my artistic training and background, but without knowing the social context of the site, there seems to be a clear biological structuring, or a similarity to a cell, and not a grid cell, an organic cell. I just wondered whether there was any biological investigation into the site, into the organisation of the sites.
Yeah, there is, and it really focuses on the soil. I mean, biological and chemical. I mean, if you want to read the article, which I put up earlier, it's all about earthworms, actually, and the way that they hypothesize that the human occupation of these soils actually triggered soil formation processes that otherwise wouldn't have occurred. I think this is going to be a very controversial theory in archaeology.
Am I getting so
We need
slow?
A lot more data to convince people, but it's out there to be discussed. So there is certainly a strong biological component to all of this.
Thank you.
Is there? I don't know how credible this is, but
What the fuck are you doing?
Also how
Pussy?
it's a sort of cultivated
That's right.
entirely, and even some people going as far as to call it a garden.
That's right. And in fact, my colleague Manuel Arroyo Quelin has worked both in Amazonia on the terra pretas and other anthropogenic soils of that region, and he's also done some work in Ukraine with John and Bissaka. And people are certainly beginning to think, I think, in a completely different way.
That was beautiful.
about the anthropogenic component of soils and sediments. My colleague Liz Graham here, I believe, has done similar work in Belize recently. It's really changing our whole notion of archaeology and urban archaeology, I think, in particular. And you're right, I think Amazonia is the region where a lot of this work was really pioneered, actually, and is now spilling into other parts of the record.
It throws up a very challenging question about the distinction between nature and the history of
Yeah, I mean, you can't
anthropogenic
strictly make a distinction anymore in some of these cases.
Can we get the mic, please?
Thanks. I understand that you don't entirely accept the thesis, so I'm hesitant to ask you to speak on its behalf.
The one about the soil
About the soil.
formation.
I
yeah.
found it exquisite. It literally brought a tear to my eye when you said it. Is the contention that it was at any point an intentional process, or
That's a good question. And from recollection, they've only published one piece on this, and I've been to visit that research group. They're based at the University of Kiel in Germany. I'm not sure how much they formulated an opinion on that question, so I wouldn't really want to speak for them. I want to believe it. I can just see some legitimate reservations, but it's a hell of an idea.
Thank you. I have a question around what might be characterized as around the production of an ecological image, and I was just curious. I was thinking about the
That
conditions of
window
drought,
really just
that we
destroyed me. I should have just
experienced, and there was
waited.
this kind of,
Should have slowed
surfacing
down,
of a lot
slowed
of
it right down.
archaeological sites as a consequence of riverbeds drying up, etc. So there is a way in which
Alas, I did not. And it ruined me.